We don't get sick from eating too much. We get sick from eating things created to mask the collapse of our currency. That's one of the key statements from Martulia's book, Fatfood Asterisk. A line not meant to shock, but enough to make readers pause because it doesn't blame the individual, nor does it soothe the listener with pleasant advice. It simply, quietly reverses a familiar question. The problem isn't that people eat incorrectly, but that the system forces them to eat incorrectly. This book is not a diet book, nor is it a purely financial one. Martulia approaches human health from a perspective few dare to touch: currency. He traces the path of inflation, of fiat money, of economic decisions that seem far removed from our meals, only to reveal an alarming connection. When money loses value, real food is marginalized, and health silently pays the price. Here, meat isn't eliminated because of honest science. It's eliminated because it doesn't fit an economy that demands cheap calories. Industrial food doesn't triumph because it nourishes people better, but because it hides inflation more effectively. And diseases don't explode because people are weak, but because they live in a system that systematically makes staying healthy difficult. The question isn't, what should we eat? The deeper question is, when every recommendation is stamped with science, how do we distinguish biological truth from the product of an economic order protecting itself? When the body constantly sends signals of fatigue, weight gain, and disorder, is the problem personal discipline or the invisible rules governing daily life? If the food on our table reflects the state of money in our wallet, what is today's meal saying about the society we live in? And more importantly, is there a way out, or are we just making minor adjustments in a system that's fundamentally flawed? In the early 20th century, before people knew the concept of dieting, before they feared fat or counted calories, meals were tied to survival instincts. Meat was central. Eggs, butter, whole milk appeared naturally on the table, not because someone believed in a theory, but because that was how humans had lived for thousands of years. At the same time, money also bore a similar characteristic. It had weight limits, with the discipline of gold backing every paper note as an unbreakable promise between the state and its citizens. In that world, saving made sense. Today's labor wasn't drained by an invisible force tomorrow. People didn't need to race against time to buy things before money lost value. Meat wasn't a luxury, heart disease wasn't an obsession. From the dining table to the wallet, everything operated slowly, orderly, and was difficult to deceive. Then war appeared. As empires plunged into global slaughter, costs were no longer abstract figures. Guns, warships, armies demanded something the treasury didn't have enough of: gold. Promises printed on paper began to outweigh the metal in the vaults. And at that moment, a man stepped out of academic shadows, carrying an idea with more lasting destructive power than any bomb. He didn't invent paper money, he invented the story to protect it. During the British financial crisis of 1914, when people queued to exchange paper for gold, Keynes proposed a seemingly clever solution. Keep the gold for the state, give paper to the people, and create enough red tape to make ordinary people never want to reclaim what was theirs. In form, gold still existed. In essence, it had been stripped from daily life. From that moment, a dangerous precedent was set. The state could spend first, pay later. It could conceal failures with academic language. It could call inflation policy and consider the devaluation of money necessary for social stability. No voting, no public debate, no explanation needed. Each new banknote printed gradually thinned the purchasing power of those who never agreed. Their labor was drained bit by bit, not by violence but by mathematics. And remarkably, this process occurred slowly enough not to cause revolt, yet persistently enough to change the entire social structure. As the gold standard wavered, time itself became distorted. Saving became naive behavior, quick spending was encouraged, and the future was mortgaged to feed the present. Such a society needed cheap things, abundant and easy to mass produce. It couldn't rely on food that required time, care, and real resources. Here, money and food began to converge. Though no one yet named this connection, Keynes's ideas weren't confined to central banks. They spread into universities, into policy, into how people understood value. When money could be created from paper, all other limits softened. If resources were lacking, adjust the definition. If gold wasn't enough, change the standards. If reality didn't serve the system, teach people to see reality differently. It was in this ideological space that science began to take on a new role. No longer merely a tool of discovery, it became a moral cloak for decisions already made. As society entered the latter half of the 20th century, anxiety no longer revolved around war or money, but shifted to the human body. Heart disease appeared, fear spread, the media needed answers. The state needed solutions. The system needed a new narrative to maintain the order established beforehand. And at the intersection of collective fear and selective science, another figure prepared to step onto the stage, not from a bank, not from a treasury, but from a laboratory carrying a hypothesis simple enough to be believed, convenient enough to be applied, and dangerous enough to change the diet of all humanity. From here, the story would diverge, where food was no longer seen as something that nourished people, but as a variable to be controlled to protect a system unbalanced at its roots. From the fear just sown, society entered another phase, no longer the fear of lacking money or war, but the fear named the body. When heart attacks soared after World War II, America faced, for the first time, an invisible enemy within its own chest. People panicked, the media amplified, and the system needed an explanation convincing enough to reassure the masses, simple enough for widespread adoption. Into that void, Ancel Keys emerged as the one to redefine the enemy of the meal. He wasn't a cardiologist. He didn't come from nutritional science. He was a physiologist, accustomed to working with bodies in a laboratory, with data tailored to pre-existing hypotheses. But he had what the system needed more than any degree: the ability to tell a scientific story that made others believe it couldn't be wrong. When President Eisenhower collapsed from a heart attack, the entire nation held its breath. If the most powerful man wasn't safe, who would be next? Keys provided the answer at just the right time. No need for complexity, no need to re-examine the entire modern lifestyle, just a single culprit: fat, especially fat from red meat. Keys built his story by cherry-picking data. In his famous multi-country study, he only kept the numbers that fit his predetermined conclusion, discarding places where people ate a lot of meat but didn't suffer from heart disease. The public didn't know that. The media didn't mention it, and health agencies didn't want to mention it. When a hypothesis is repeated often enough, it no longer needs to be true, it just needs to be familiar. Fat was labeled dangerous. Cholesterol became a terrifying keyword. Meat was pushed off the dining table with morally disguised scientific language, while carbohydrates, sugar, and vegetable oils, which had never been the biological foundation of humanity, were dressed in the guise of health. Here, the story didn't stop in the laboratory. Another ideological current was waiting to adopt and amplify that message for decades. A religious movement in the U.S. viewed avoiding meat not just as a dietary choice, but as an expression of moral purity. They believed meat stimulated desires, degraded the spirit, and pulled people away from self-control. From schools and hospitals to research organizations, this ideology blended perfectly with Keys's hypothesis. One side provided the moral impetus, the other provided the scientific language. When the two met, they created a new frame of reference where eating meat was not only seen as unhealthy, but also a morally wrong choice. Children were taught to eat less meat to be healthy. Patients were advised to avoid fat to live longer, and no one questioned why. At the same time, obesity and diabetes rates began to rise. No coercion was needed, just enough anxiety sown. When people fear disease, they readily hand over decision-making power to experts. When experts speak in scientific language, few dare to doubt. And when the state stamps its approval, doubt becomes deviant behavior. In a context where money had lost its discipline, society began to accept something different. Food no longer needed to nourish humans, it just needed to be cheap enough to maintain the system. Meat, which required time, land, and care, became inconvenient. Grains and seed oils, easy to produce, easy to store, fit perfectly with an economy sliding into inflation. This current tightened its grip. Devaluing money forced food to be cheap. Cheap food forced science to bend. And bent science, in turn, shaped the eating habits of hundreds of millions. At this point, the seeds that had germinated were no longer isolated ideas, no longer debatable hypotheses, but a new order where the dining table reflected the instability of the monetary system behind it. And when economic interests realized that this order could bring enormous profits, another force entered the fray. This force didn't wear lab coats or carry the Bible. It carried logos, production lines, and the ability to turn hypotheses into mass-produced products. The current was strong enough to be irreversible. When currency devaluation became a permanent state and the fear of disease was deeply embedded in the collective mind, a practical question arose. Who would provide food for a society that needed to eat cheaply, abundantly, and constantly? The answer didn't come from pastures or small farms. It came from factories, from refined seeds, from oils pressed with solvents, from assembly lines that could run day and night without waiting for nature's permission. Refined grains, sugar, industrial seed oils had an undeniable advantage. They fit perfectly with fiat money. Cheap to produce, easy to store, easy to transport, and endlessly consumable in an economy where purchasing power was eroded year by year. Such products weren't just convenient, they were a condition for the system's survival. Meat, conversely, required time, land, effort, and biological discipline. It carried limits, and all limits are the enemy of inflation. Nutritional science provided the story, businesses provided the products, the state provided legitimacy. These three forces didn't need to sit at the same table to conspire. They just needed to collectively benefit from a single outcome. When industrial food was labeled healthy, when the food pyramid encouraged carbohydrates and limited meat, when hospitals and schools repeated the same message, the new order became invisible. It didn't need to be enforced, it was accepted as self-evident. In that order, people were advised to eat more of the things that made them hungry faster. They were taught to avoid the foods that once nourished their ancestors. And when the body rebelled with obesity, diabetes, and chronic fatigue, the answer wasn't to change the foundation, but to add medication, add guidelines, add control. Camp David 1971 marked the irreversible moment when the last link to gold was severed. The world entered an era without an anchor. Money could be created infinitely, debt could be postponed indefinitely, and prices, especially food prices, became political tools to hide inflation. Food had asterisk to be cheap. For food to be cheap, it had to be industrialized. To industrialize, science had to adjust its language. From that moment, the relationship between humans and food was reversed. Food no longer existed to serve biology. Biology was required to adapt to food. When adaptation failed, individuals were blamed. They were told they ate wrong, didn't exercise enough, lacked discipline. The system stood clean, blameless. Fat food was not an accident but an inevitable product of fiat money in a society where saving was punished and consumption was rewarded. Food had to be addictive, convenient, cheap. It had to make people return to buy more before realizing the consequences. And when consequences appeared, they created a new market for medicine, for treatment, for managing chronic diseases. The circle closed, no malice needed, just incentives. The seeds had been sown long ago, they didn't kill immediately. They needed time. They needed generations. They needed the patience of a system that understood that slow impact is lasting impact. When people became accustomed to distrusting their own satiety signals, when they learned to fear foods that once nourished their ancestors, when they accepted that their bodies needed to be guided by charts and recommendations, autonomy was withdrawn without a single law. At this endpoint, all the pieces were in place. Money had lost discipline, science had lost neutrality, food had lost its naturalness, and people had lost the ability to distinguish between true needs and the products of a system that needed them to keep consuming to survive. This story doesn't end in an immediate disaster. It ends in the normalization of what is wrong. And it is in that normalization that a society can slide for decades without realizing that its health, freedom, and future have been traded for short-term convenience. Here, the poisonous seeds have completed their mission, the rest is merely consequence. And from that ground, another question begins to form, no longer about who caused this, but whether there is still a way out. The flow of the story doesn't change direction, it only goes deeper. Once the foundation was laid with undisciplined money and bent science, the system began to believe its own illusions. Not because it was foolish, but because it had to believe to continue existing. A society accustomed to spending first and paying later will always find ways to rationalize creating wealth from thin air. In the past, alchemy promised to turn base metals into gold. Today, fiat money promises to turn paper into prosperity. The only difference lies in the language. Alchemy was considered superstition. Fiat money is wrapped in academic terminology, economic models, and policy reports. But the essence remains unchanged. It still relies on a core belief that one can consume without corresponding production, distribute without creating real value. This belief didn't appear overnight. It was nurtured over decades. Each crisis was solved by printing more money-first wars, then recessions, then welfare programs, bailouts, economic stimulus. Each time, the consequences didn't disappear, they were merely pushed into the future. And the future, gradually, became a place no one wanted to look directly at. The system doesn't deny inflation, it merely asserts that inflation can be managed. A little inflation is good for growth, a little devaluation is necessary for employment. A little sacrifice of today's purchasing power will bring tomorrow's stability. These statements are repeated until they become self-evident truths, even if no one in daily life truly feels the benefits they promise. The danger lies here. When a policy causes slow harm, people tend to doubt themselves more than they doubt the system. Prices rise year after year, savings by less. But each individual is told that the cause lies elsewhere. Global markets, energy crises, climate change, never the fundamental devaluation of money. The system doesn't need to lie, it just needs to choose what to say that is beneficial. Price indices are adjusted, essential expenditures are removed from calculations, food and energy prices are seen as temporary fluctuations. The result is a reassuring picture where official inflation is much lower than people's actual perception. When language becomes technocratic, resistance becomes difficult. People may feel poorer but cannot prove it with charts. And when they cannot prove it, they are advised to trust the experts. This trust gradually replaces lived experience. People learn to doubt their own feelings. At a deeper level, inflation doesn't just impoverish people, it changes how society organizes life. When money doesn't hold its value, everything must be made cheaper. Homes shrink, time is compressed, and food, which constitutes a large part of workers' budgets, becomes the first target for cuts. This isn't a moral decision, it's a logical consequence. A society based on devaluation cannot sustain a diet based on real resources. It needs cheap calories, easy to produce, easy to consume. It needs food that can multiply at the rate of a printing press. From here, invisible pressure begins to bear down in one direction. No need for commands, no need for coercion, just let the system operate by its own inertia. Science will be encouraged to research what reduces costs. Businesses will invest in what fits the cash flow, and policy will legitimize what has become popular. When power believes it has found the modern philosopher's stone, all other limits become troublesome. Biology is seen as an obstacle, tradition as outdated, instinct as dangerous. Humans are required to adapt to the system, not the system to serve humans. At the end of this part of the story, there are no exploding diseases, no collective outrage, only a silent but firm belief that everything can be managed from the top down, as long as there is enough data, enough experts, and enough monetary power. But that belief needs more than itself to sustain. It needs partners willing to benefit, and it is at this point that alliances begin to form, not by oaths, but by common interest. The current is moving towards where other forces will join, pulling society into a vortex not easily escaped. When a belief has been repeated long enough, it begins to attract other forces to orbit around it. Not because they are summoned, but because they realize a simple truth. By seeing the world the same way, everyone benefits. No secret conspiracies needed, just overlapping interests. And when that happens, an alliance forms quietly but persistently. The state needs a story to hide inflation. Businesses need a stable environment to scale. Academia needs funding to exist. These three needs meet at a common point, redefining reality. When reality is redefined, inconvenient questions are no longer asked. Instead, the system begins to answer the questions it creates itself. At the heart of this alliance is food, not because food is the goal, but because it is the most effective means to regulate daily life. Food appears 3 times a day. It enters every home, every body. And if food can be controlled cognitively, human behavior will change in a way more sustainable than any law. What is taught in schools no longer starts with human biology, but with the needs of the system. Carbohydrates are placed at the base, meat is pushed to the top as something to be limited. Vegetable oils are called healthy, not because the human body evolved to consume them, but because they are suitable for mass production. When knowledge is standardized in this way, new generations of experts are trained within the same framework of thought, the same language, the same blind spots. Medical students learn nutrition through charts, nutritionists learn to advise eating according to the pyramid, teachers learn to convey guidelines stamped with scientific approval. None of them are encouraged to question the foundation. And when a mindset has been repeated for generations, it no longer needs to be defended, it sustains itself. Research does not occur in a vacuum, it needs money, and money always comes with expectations. Questions that promise results favorable to industrial production are more likely to be funded. Studies that challenge the foundation will be marginalized. They don't need to be banned, they just need to not be funded, not published, not cited. Gradually, what is called scientific consensus forms, not because all evidence points in one direction, but because other directions are no longer seen. At that point, debate becomes deviant behavior. Those who question are labeled dangerous, and the system continues to operate smoothly, efficiently, undisturbed. The individuals who emerge from this educational system carry the same assumptions into hospitals, clinics, and consulting rooms. When patients appear with metabolic symptoms, the answer never returns to foundational food. It returns to calorie counts, percentages, and compliance. If the patient doesn't get better, the problem is assumed to lie with the individual, not the recommendations. In this model, failure never belongs to the system. It is always individualized. Patients are told they lack discipline, understanding, or effort. And when they tire of not improving, another solution is offered, not to correct the root cause, but to manage the consequences. The state can say they are just following science. Science can say they are just providing data. Businesses can say they are just meeting market demand. Each party has a plausible reason to stand apart from the consequences, and it is this fragmentation of responsibility that makes the system invulnerable. At a deeper level, what is happening is not deliberate malice, but collective adaptation to a false premise. When currency devaluation forces everything to be cheap, and when cheapness becomes the highest priority, what cannot be cheap is discarded, whether it's health or biological truth. When food is redefined in education, when perception is locked into specialization, medicine steps into the role not of a healer but of a manager. And from here, another machine begins to reveal itself, a machine that thrives not on health, but on prolonged illness. The current now isn't in ideas or textbooks, it's imprinted directly on human bodies. When food that causes disorder is legitimized, when education has locked down thinking, medicine steps into its final role in that operating chain, not to question the foundations, but to manage the consequences that are becoming increasingly apparent. The body reacts to industrial food with clear signals: weight gain, blood sugar dysregulation, inflammation, chronic fatigue. But instead of returning to the dining table, the system turns to the pharmacy. Each symptom is matched with a prescription. Each prescription comes with a promise of control: no need to cure, just stabilize. And in this language, stabilize means keeping the patient in a state where they can continue to consume. The loop becomes perfect. Food causes illness, creates patients. Patients create demand for long-term treatment. Long-term treatment generates revenue. No one in that chain needs to break the loop, because every link is rewarded when the loop continues to turn. When recommendations are institutionalized, they are no longer opinions, they become norms. Schools teach accordingly, hospitals operate accordingly. The military, welfare programs, communal kitchens all repeat the same structure. Once it becomes the standard, the question is no longer right or wrong, but compliance or noncompliance. At this stage, individual responsibility disappears. No one is held accountable for the deteriorating health outcomes of society as a whole because every decision is shielded by official legitimacy. Error no longer has a name. It merely exists as the ground on which everyone stands. Obesity doesn't appear randomly. Diabetes doesn't explode without cause. Heart disease doesn't return because people are suddenly weaker than their ancestors. They are the predictable results of a system that encourages the consumption of cheap calories, disrupts metabolism, and then blames individuals when their bodies refuse to adapt. Devaluing money makes real food a luxury, industrial food the default choice, and declining health is seen as an ancillary cost of progress. No one calls it systemic failure, it's called a public health challenge. When finance is controlled, financial choices narrow. When food is defined, nutritional choices narrow. And when medicine steps in, ultimate decision-making power leaves the individual. People are advised to trust guidelines more than their own hunger and satiety signals, to trust charts more than biological feedback, to trust prescriptions more than questioning the fundamental cause. Dependence doesn't come from coercion, it comes from substitution. Each time individuals hand over decision-making power to the system, they are promised safety. But that safety always comes with a trade-off. And the biggest trade-off is the ability to understand one's own body. Once gone too far, turning back becomes dangerous. Admitting error means admitting that decades of policy, recommendations, and treatments have been based on a skewed foundation. That cannot happen easily. So the system chooses the most familiar path: continue to add guidelines, add medications, add control, and continue to hide the original error with new layers of explanation. At this endpoint, the story is no longer about a single decision or a specific group of people. It is about the inertia of a structure that has locked itself into a vortex. This vortex doesn't kill immediately. It erodes. It accustoms people to being unwell, to being dependent, to the idea that this is the price of modern society. But precisely when everything has been standardized to this extent, an unavoidable question begins to emerge. If the problem isn't with individuals, if this system is forced to continue being wrong to survive, then is there any other way out? That question doesn't demand more control. It demands a new anchor, something that cannot be printed more of, cannot be adjusted by policy, and cannot be bent by short-term interests. The question is no longer who caused this situation, but whether the trajectory can be changed. When a system has forced people to adapt to what is wrong, the solution cannot lie in better managing those errors. It must begin by changing the very rules that make the errors inevitable. And the deepest rule governing all other behaviors is money. When money cannot be created from thin air, every decision is forced to confront real consequences. No longer is there the ability to postpone the price to be paid through silent inflation. Society must return to an old but unavoidable principle. To consume, one must produce. To spend, one must have saved beforehand. This is not a moral appeal. It is the natural consequence of a monetary rule that does not allow for cheating time. In such a system, time regains its value, long-term planning becomes rational. Sacrificing the present to build the future is no longer foolish behavior. And when people begin to think long-term, they automatically change how they live, how they work, and even how they eat without any propaganda campaign. When money holds its value, accumulation is no longer a losing game. Businesses cannot rely on cheap cash flow to mask inefficiency. Investors cannot profit simply by anticipating policy. Every behavior must be based on real value. In this context, business models that thrive on privilege and subsidies begin to reveal their fragility. Industrial food is no exception. As preferential cash flow dries up, artificial advantages disappear. Products that existed due to distorted costs must confront the most basic question: are they truly worth consuming? And for the first time in decades, that question cannot be evaded with academia or advertising. In a monetary system that cannot be manipulated, businesses no longer have a reason to lobby instead of improving products. Profit returns to its original role, a reward for serving people better. When there are no longer political incentives to protect unsustainable models, the market begins to perform its natural selection function. This doesn't happen overnight, but it happens surely. Businesses dependent on distortion will shrink. Businesses that create real value will survive. And with that, industries that thrive on providing cheap but long-term harmful calories will gradually lose their central position. When money cannot be inflated, all costs must be accounted for accurately. Land, energy, labor are no longer hidden under layers of inflation. Food must reflect its true value. And in such an environment, the difference between food that nourishes people and food that merely fills the stomach becomes clear. No commands needed, no prohibitions, just let prices speak the truth. Then human behavior self-adjusts. They don't need to be taught how to eat. They just need not to be deceived anymore. This current is not about creating a perfect society, it merely eliminates the possibility of systemic fraud. And when fraud is no longer easy, bad decisions lose their protective layers. People don't become better because they are more educated. They become more aware because they are no longer distorted by a false rule. At this point, the change has only just begun. Money has been put back in its place. Societal incentives begin to shift, but there is still another layer of power untouched, where the biggest decisions are made without confronting their true costs. And when that layer is forced to change, the consequences will ripple directly into policy, into daily eating, and into people's ability to determine their own destiny. When the monetary rules have changed, an unavoidable consequence emerges. Power can no longer hide the true costs of major decisions. There's no longer a way to push the price to be paid into the future through silent inflation. And when that happens, politics is forced to confront real people, real needs, and real opposition. In a system where money cannot be arbitrarily created, every expansion of power requires real resources. Wars cannot be funded by numbers on a screen. Welfare cannot be promised indefinitely without asking who will pay. Every grand plan must pass through the gate of direct taxes, real debt, and most importantly, societal consensus. When costs are no longer hidden, incentives change. Decisions become more cautious. Projects that cannot demonstrate real benefits are postponed. The boom-bust cycle, fueled by cheap money, begins to contract, not because people become more moral, but because they no longer have the tools to escape consequences. When inflation cannot be used to buy silence, power must persuade. When cheap money cannot be used to inflate the bureaucracy, the state must prioritize. This doesn't create a perfect government, it merely creates a government that is limited. And it is this limitation that is the foundation of responsibility. This change doesn't just stop at budgets or foreign policy. It directly touches daily life, where an area seemingly far from politics is most deeply affected. Food. For decades, food was shaped not by biology or culture, but by subsidies, biased research, and propaganda fueled by cheap money. As that money dries up, this structure begins to crack. Industries that lived on privileges no longer have support. Nutritional messages are no longer amplified indefinitely. Prices begin to reflect true costs. Industrial food loses its artificial advantage, no longer having the resources to maintain abnormally cheap but long-term harmful products. And when the distortion disappears, food doesn't need moral or scientific labels to persuade. It just needs to prove that it nourishes people better. No campaigns for healthy eating are needed, no imposed portion sizes, just let the monetary rules do their work. When costs are not hidden, behavior self-adjusts. People are no longer pushed into cheap but harmful choices. They return to what makes their bodies full longer, stable, and less dependent. Meat and real food don't need to be saved by slogans. They just need not to be punished by a distorted monetary system. When subsidies and propaganda no longer have funding, choices that were once marginalized gradually return to their natural place. This change doesn't happen through top-down commands. It happens by removing the tools of concealment. When power can no longer postpone consequences, society begins to heal from the roots, not by better management, but by no longer allowing fraud. At this point, what was once considered normal begins to be questioned. Guidelines once considered self-evident begin to be re-examined, not because people are suddenly rebellious, but because they are no longer forced to believe in a pre-constructed reality. But the deepest change isn't in policy or prices. It's where power directly touches each individual. When money becomes neutral, when food becomes real, another question begins to echo. Can people reclaim self-determination over their own lives and bodies? The current is moving towards that, where the solution is no longer to adjust the system from the outside, but to return to individuals the ability to own, choose, and take responsibility. And when that happens, the story is no longer about control, but about freedom. When money is no longer distorted, and the dining table begins to reflect true costs, the deepest change emerges. It lies not in policy or markets, but in people. In the moment, each individual realizes that the greatest power ever taken away was not money, but the ability to self-determine their own body and life. In an order where value can be printed more of, ownership becomes fragile. Today's labor can be drained tomorrow without asking the consent of its creator. When that happens, freedom is just a legal concept, not a lived experience. Conversely, when value cannot be created from thin air, ownership becomes tangible. People can retain the fruits of their labor without fear of erosion by an invisible force. And from that point, freedom doesn't need to be bestowed, it simply appears. When intermediate layers no longer have the ability to manipulate, the relationship between people and their choices becomes direct. No guiding messages needed, no imposed recommendations. People begin to trust their own biological feedback instead of charts, trust their feelings of hunger and fullness instead of formulas, trust lived experience instead of abstract promises. This change is not noisy. It happens quietly but persistently. There was a time when everything seemed normal. Eating according to guidelines, trusting labels, living amidst foods designed for convenience. And then the body began to speak. Weight increased, energy plummeted, chronic fatigue became the default state. No major shock, just the accumulation of unwell days, seen as the price of modern life. The moment of awakening doesn't come from books. It comes from colliding with reality. When seeing oneself in the mirror of a weary society, the natural question arises. If everything is as taught, why are the results so uniformly wrong? From that question, the journey of understanding begins, not to rebel, but to comprehend. The solution doesn't lie in fasting or extreme control. It lies in returning to nourish the body with what makes it stable. When real food is brought back to the center, cravings disappear naturally. No iron discipline needed, no fighting with oneself. The body, when provided with adequate nutrition, will self-regulate. Simplicity becomes an advantage, not a sacrifice. In this process, the important thing is not to change the menu, but to change the framework of thinking. When industrial language is removed, when food is no longer divided into good or bad according to ideology, people learn to listen to direct feedback from their bodies. And that feedback, when undistorted, is always honest. No system completely eliminates suffering or error, but there are rules that do not allow errors to multiply infinitely. When money is real, food is real, and choices are real, people have the opportunity to live in harmony with their biology instead of against it. Freedom in this context is not doing whatever one wants, but not being forced to do things that deplete oneself. At this endpoint, the story doesn't conclude with a command or an appeal. It concludes with an awareness that many things once considered personal actually originate from systemic rules. And when the rules change, individuals don't need to be saved. They just need not to be hindered anymore. When value cannot be printed more of, when food is not distorted, and when people regain ownership of themselves, a new possibility emerges. Not the ability to control better, but the ability to live more authentically. And sometimes, that is all a society needs to begin to heal. When all the pieces are in place, what remains is not an appeal but an awakening. No magic, no shortcuts, just a direct look at the relationship between money, food, and freedom, and then accepting the consequences of that truth. People don't lose their health because they are weaker than their ancestors. They lose it because the rules around them force them to live contrary to their biology. When money is distorted, all signals are distorted. When food is industrialized, the body is forced to adapt. And when adaptation fails, the individual is blamed. The greatest injustice lies there. No one needs to be a hero. No one needs to fight the whole world. Change begins with small choices, but those choices only have meaning when they are no longer punished by a fraudulent system. When value is preserved, when costs are not hidden, people naturally return to what is sustainable, not out of morality, but out of reality. The uncomfortable truth is that many health debates were never about health. They were about power, about control, about the ability to postpone consequences. When those tools of postponement disappear, the debate becomes simple. What nourishes people survives, what depletes people cannot be hidden for long. There is no promise of a perfect world, but there is a clear reminder. Freedom cannot exist if the value of labor can be erased. Health cannot be managed from above if biological foundations are ignored, and human dignity cannot be preserved if the most basic choices are distorted by invisible interests. When money is real, time returns to its proper rhythm. When food is real, the body finds balance. When ownership is real, people don't need excessive protection, they just need not to be deceived anymore. This book closes not with a verdict but with a pause. Because after traversing a series of belief systems, new religious movements, worldviews blending spirituality, pseudoscience, and personal power, what remains is not a list of rights and wrongs. What remains is a persistent question about humanity. The greatest lesson of this book is not in identifying the cult, but in identifying the mechanism that allows cults to exist. Cults don't live by crude deceit. They live by things that sound reasonable. They don't start with extremism, but with comfort. They don't demand you give up everything immediately, but invite you to adjust your understanding little by little until you no longer stand where you thought you were standing. This book reveals a profound paradox. The more people fear uncertainty, the more easily they accept systems that promise absolute certainty. And when that certainty is handed over to an organization, an individual, or even to one's own inner experience, people trade away the ability to self-question. At that point, belief is no longer a journey to seek truth, but a refuge from fear. Another lesson, less often stated but woven throughout the entire book, is about personal responsibility, not responsibility in a superficial moral sense, but responsibility in what *1 believes. What to believe? Why believe it? On what foundation is that belief built? When belief is built on emotion, experience, or the consensus of the crowd, it is very easily led astray. When belief can no longer withstand scrutiny, it has begun to slide from its original function. The book also poses an uncomfortable but necessary question. Are many movements called liberating humanity actually placing a new burden on people? When God is blurred, when salvation is endlessly prolonged, when sin is replaced by insufficient awareness, people imagine themselves freer, but at the same time, they are forced to bear the entire responsibility of saving themselves. No support, no rest, no clear boundary between humility and spiritual arrogance. Reading this book, it's hard not to wonder. In the modern world, where every belief system can be packaged beautifully, humanely, and attractively, where is the line between open-mindedness and losing the ability to discern? If all paths are called right, what helps us know where we are going? If truth is only personal perception, on what will society stand when those perceptions conflict? There's also another question, more private but no less important. How many things are believed simply because they make one feel comfortable? How many beliefs are held onto not because they are true, but because they help people avoid confronting difficult questions? And how many times is belonging prioritized over truth? This book doesn't ask readers to become suspicious of everything. It asks for something more humble. Don't rush to grant anyone the power to define truth, not even your own emotions. Because the history of cults shows that the most dangerous deviations don't come from malice, but from the absolute certainty that one is right. If these thoughts make you pause a little longer, want to look more closely at things that seemed too familiar, then the conversation continues. These questions, not quick answers, are where a real journey of understanding begins.